that dinner table, surrounded by polished silverware and laughter that didn't include me, I felt the weight of betrayal land so heavily on my chest, I could hardly breathe. One moment, I was smiling politely, pretending to enjoy the evening, and the next, I was cut down by the very people who should have been my family. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was quiet, calculated, and cruel, slipped into the conversation like a blade pressed between my ribs. The chandelier above us cast a warm glow across the mahogany table, catching on crystal glasses and expensive plates, but none of that shine could cover the sting of humiliation. My son sat at the head of the table, looking distracted, always glancing at his phone, and his wife moved gracefully in her ivory dress, smiling the kind of smile that didn't need to say out loud what she truly thought of me. Around us, guests carried on, talking about investments and vacations, completely unaware that my world had just tilted off its axis. I remember folding my napkin tighter in my lap, trying to hold myself together. I'd been invisible for most of the night, spoken over, dismissed, treated as though my presence was more of a courtesy than a contribution. But then came the remark that made my cheeks burn and my heart thud against my ribs. It was delivered with a laugh, soft enough for others to mistake as a joke, but sharp enough that I knew the truth in it. At that moment, I felt the air leave my body. I stared down at my plate. At food I no longer had the stomach to eat. Around me, forks clinked and glasses clattered. But all I heard was the echo of that single insult replaying in my mind. My son's face tightened, but he said nothing. That silence was worse than the words themselves. In that silence, I understood my place not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as a nuisance, tolerated only out of obligation. I lifted my glass of water to my lips just to have something to do with my hands, but even that trembled. And as I sat there in the middle of that glittering room, with people I should have called family, I realized that this wasn't just about a cruel comment. It was about something much deeper, respect that had been quietly stripped away without me noticing. That was the moment everything changed for me. And to explain how I ended up in that chair, humiliated in my own son's home, I need to take you back. Because this story didn't begin with that dinner. It began long before, with small cracks in the foundation that no one else seemed to see. When I think back on it now, the cracks had been showing for years. They didn't appear all at once, not like the shattering words at that dinner table. No, they arrived in tiny pieces, in moments so small that at first I brushed them aside. A raised eyebrow when I wore my old cardigan. A sigh when I brought over my homemade rolls instead of some expensive dessert from the bakery downtown. A smile that looked polite enough to others but never quite touched the eyes. It started after my son, David, married Claire. I wanted to believe it was simply a matter of adjustment. New families always take time to blend, I told myself. But little by little, I felt the distance grow. I remember standing in their new home for the first time, marble counters gleaming under the recessed lights, every corner decorated with curated perfection. It was stunning, no doubt about that, but I couldn't help but feel out of place with my worn handbag and the shoes I'd bought on clearance. Claire gave me the grand tour with a smile, pointing out imported furniture and designer wallpaper, while I nodded and admired, though my mind wandered back to the modest little house I'd kept up for decades with second-hand furniture and hand-sewn curtains. Family gatherings became lessons in exclusion. There were vacations I only heard about after the fact, through casual mentions, birthdays where I was invited late, or not at all, because apparently plans had already been made. And when I did show up, I often found myself sitting at the edge of the room, listening to conversations that spun around investments, stock portfolios, and travel destinations. I tried to contribute, tried to ask questions, but the way their eyes glazed over told me they weren't interested in what I had to say. What stung most wasn't the luxury itself. It was the subtle message that who I was and what I had to offer wasn't good enough. My simple gifts, my modest presence, seemed to shrink against the backdrop of their perfect life. I kept bringing the dinner rolls, though David had loved them since he was a boy, and I held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he still felt a connection to the mother who raised him with what little I had. Over time, the passive-aggressive remarks began to cut deeper. Claire had a way of praising me while slipping in a sting. "You look nice," she would say, glancing at my thrift store blouse. Or, "You're so thoughtful to help, even if you don't understand how things are done these days." I smiled through it, telling myself not to cause waves. I convinced myself it wasn't worth ruining family harmony. But the truth is, harmony had already been lost. I had become a guest in a family I helped build. I sat through conversations where my words carried no weight. I saw my grandchildren run to Claire's parents for hugs first, while my arms stayed empty a little too long. Those small slights added up. Each one left a tiny bruise, invisible to everyone else, but aching inside me. Still, I endured it. I cooked. I visited. I smiled. Because what else could I do? I loved my son. I loved my grandchildren. And I wasn't going to let pride push me away. But what they didn't know, what even I didn't fully realize at the time, was that behind my quiet nods and gentle patience was a woman who had endured much harder trials. I had raised a child alone after my husband passed, balancing 2 jobs and night classes. I had stretched every dollar until it frayed. I had fought through loneliness that would have swallowed weaker hearts. I was far from fragile, though they all seemed to think I was. Looking back, I see now that those humiliations were more than just petty slights. They were the quiet warnings, the early tremors before the earthquake. I ignored them because admitting the truth would have been too painful, that the family I dreamed of wasn't the family I had. And maybe if I had paid closer attention, I would have been ready for what was coming. Because the betrayal that broke everything open didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building, piece by piece, while I told myself to stay quiet. And when it finally came crashing down, I realized those little humiliations were only the surface of something far darker. The night it all came to light, I felt my world tilt in a way I never thought possible. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with screaming or slammed doors. Sometimes, it slips in under the weight of silence, in the form of a single accusation that flips your entire reality upside down. I was sitting at that polished dining table, the smell of roasted meat and buttered vegetables still hanging in the air, when my son looked straight at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He spoke about money, an outrageous sum, the kind of figure that would take me a lifetime to even imagine, let alone hold in my hands. He claimed he had given it to me, that it was missing, that somehow it had disappeared under my name. At first, I thought I had misheard him. The words sounded like a cruel joke. $300,000. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, my body refusing to move. I searched his face, desperate for a flicker of humor, some sign this was a misunderstanding. but all I found was cold suspicion in his eyes. The room seemed to shrink around me. I could feel every pair of eyes watching, waiting, judging. Claire pressed her glass too tightly, her fingers trembling, her perfect composure cracking just enough to betray something she didn't mean to show. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about confusion. This was planned. Someone had laid the groundwork for this moment, and I was the scapegoat. My heart dropped into my stomach. I thought back over the last months, the times Claire insisted on helping me with my paperwork, the times she asked for details about my bank, my accounts, my social security number, all under the guise of making things easier for me as I got older. It clicked like a puzzle snapping into place. I wasn't just being insulted. I was being framed. Anger rose in me so sharply, it felt like fire in my veins. I wanted to scream, to demand how they could think so little of me, how my own son could believe I had taken something so massive, so reckless. But I kept still. I knew that one wrong move, one word said in desperation, would only make me look guilty. So I steadied myself. I told them, as calmly as I could, that they were mistaken, that I had never received such money, that my life, the coupon clipping, the simple apartment, the worn-out clothes was proof enough. But even as I spoke, I could see doubt clouding my son's face. My word wasn't enough. Inside, a storm raged. Sadness gave way to outrage. Outrage hardened into resolve. If they thought they could bury me under lies, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I had endured worse than this. I had clawed my way through struggles they couldn't even imagine. And now, I would fight not just for my name, but for the truth. That dinner ended with more questions than answers, but I left with something more important than their approval. I left with a mission. I would not sit back quietly while my name was dragged through the mud. I would uncover the truth, even if it meant exposing the very people I had once called family. What I didn't realize then was that the betrayal went far deeper than I imagined. And the quiet investigation I was about to begin would lead me into places darker than I ever thought my family could go. In the days that followed that dinner, I felt as if I were living in two different worlds. On the surface, I went about my routine like nothing had happened, grocery shopping on Tuesdays, volunteering at the library on Thursdays, keeping up with the rhythm that had defined my quiet life. But beneath that steady exterior, I was unraveling and rebuilding at the same time. The accusation played in my head on a loop. $300,000. My own son looking at me like I was a thief. The words cut deeper each time I replayed them. For a while, I almost let the shame swallow me whole. Maybe this was how it ended for me, branded with a lie I could never shake. I cried in the silence of my apartment more nights than I'd like to admit. Loneliness has a way of echoing louder when the people who should defend you are the ones tearing you apart. But something inside me refused to stay broken. I had been underestimated my whole life, treated as fragile because of my age, my modest means, my quiet nature. But I knew better. I had survived harder storms than this, and if they thought I would fold, they were wrong. So I began to dig. Quietly, carefully. I pulled out years of bank statements and laid them across my dining table, studying every line until my eyes ached. I checked every account I had, knowing I wouldn't find the missing money, but also knowing that the absence of it was proof. Proof that I wasn't lying. Proof that someone else had orchestrated this. Late at night, I would sit with my reading glasses perched on the edge of my nose, highlighter in hand, combing through old records. I remembered how Claire had offered to help me set up online banking after my husband died, insisting it would be easier for me. I thought back to the way she always asked for copies of my documents, telling me it was for emergencies. At the time, I believed her. Now, those memories felt like puzzle pieces snapping into place. I started writing everything down in a notebook, every suspicious glance, every unusual request, every instance where she had more information about me than she should have. It felt strange, keeping records like that, but it gave me focus. It gave me strength. There were nights I doubted myself, when exhaustion whispered that maybe I should just let it go. I was, after all, a grandmother in her late 60s. Did I really have the strength to go up against them? But then I would picture my son's eyes, heavy with suspicion, and I knew I couldn't stop. My dignity mattered. My truth mattered. Slowly, determination began to replace despair. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing for the moment when the truth would come out, when the careful facade Claire had built would start to crack. What I didn't know yet was that the betrayal went even deeper than I imagined. The missing money was only the beginning, and soon I would uncover a revelation so shocking it would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Just when I thought I had pieced the story together, the ground shifted again. I believed the missing money was the heart of the betrayal, that my daughter-in-law's greed and manipulation explained it all. But what I uncovered next made that accusation seem almost small in comparison. It began with a phone call I hadn't expected. An investigator reached out not because of me, but because of David's company. They said there were irregularities, large transfers, money that seemed to vanish into thin air. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence, that my family drama had nothing to do with it. But the more they explained, the clearer it became. The trail of disappearing money wasn't limited to that supposed transfer of $3,000. There were other accounts, other transactions, and my name appeared again. I felt sick to my stomach. My identity had been used to open accounts I'd never heard of, in towns I had no connection to. Transactions moved through them, draining hundreds of thousands, then millions. I sat at my small kitchen table, the stack of mail and bank statements spread before me, my hands trembling as I tried to absorb it all. This wasn't just about Claire setting me up for one theft. This was systematic. This was organized. The realization hit me like a blow. I wasn't the only target. If she could do this to me, she could do it to others. And then the even darker thought followed, maybe she already had. The woman who smiled so sweetly at holiday dinners had built her life on deception, weaving a web of lies so intricate even my son had no idea he was caught in it. Disbelief turned quickly into outrage. I thought of the years I had trusted her with family matters, the times I had let her help with paperwork, the way she had inserted herself into every detail of our lives. It hadn't been kindness, it had been surveillance. Every document I handed her, every detail I shared, had been fuel for her schemes. What horrified me most wasn't even the money. It was the lengths she had gone to. The cold calculation it took to use my name, her own mother-in-law, as a shield for her crimes. She hadn't just stolen my identity. She had tried to destroy it. And if I hadn't stumbled on these connections, she might have succeeded. The stakes were so much higher than I realized. It wasn't just my dignity on the line, it was my freedom, my future, and maybe even my safety. People who go to such lengths to cover their tracks don't stop easily. And sitting in that quiet kitchen, staring at the evidence, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had uncovered the truth, but exposing it would mean tearing apart the fragile fabric of my family. My son would have to face the fact that the woman he trusted most was at the center of something dark and dangerous. My grandchildren would see their world crumble, and me, I would no longer be the quiet grandmother in the corner. I would have to step into the storm and fight. The question wasn't whether a confrontation was coming. The question was how explosive it would be when the truth finally hit the light. The day of the confrontation still feels like a scene carved into my memory. The room was tense, thick with unspoken truths that had been festering for months. Papers and evidence lay on the table, bank statements, signatures, even photographs. For once, I wasn't the quiet, overlooked figure in the corner. I was standing in the center, holding the truth in my hands. Claire sat across from me, her perfect composure cracking as each piece of evidence was laid out. My son's face, pale and shaken, shifted from disbelief to horror as the puzzle pieces finally aligned. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, and it bore her name. My voice trembled at first, but not with fear, with power. For so long I had carried the weight of suspicion and humiliation, forced to defend myself against whispers and accusations. But in that moment, I spoke with clarity, with conviction. I laid out how she had used my identity, how she had siphoned money through accounts I never knew existed, how she had tried to place the blame on me. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. My son turned to her, his eyes wide with betrayal. The woman he thought he knew, the mother of his children, was no longer hidden behind charm or excuses. She was exposed. When the authorities finally stepped in, I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was release. A long, heavy breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months finally left my body. The truth was out, and though it tore my family apart, it also set me free. Watching Claire being led away, I didn't feel hatred. I felt something closer to sorrow. Sorrow for the family we could have been. Sorrow for the grandchildren who would have to carry this truth. But underneath that sorrow was a steady current of strength. I had survived her deception, and I had proven that I was not as weak as she believed. The confrontation was over. The downfall had come, and as the dust began to settle, I knew the hardest part was still ahead: rebuilding trust, healing wounds, and finding peace in the wreckage. Looking back, I realize betrayal doesn't just destroy trust, it also reveals strength you never knew you had. I learned that love without respect is fragile, and family without honesty is dangerous. But I also discovered that standing up for yourself, even when it's painful, is an act of love too. Love for your own dignity, and love for the generations who need to see what accountability looks like. My story is not just about loss, but resilience. If this touched you, please like, share, and comment with your own story. Your voice matters, and you're not alone.